Thanks for coming out on this beautiful summer day. Some of you are like, yeah, well, hurry up. I'm going to get out there and enjoy the weather. I totally get it. So, well, it really is good. We're in our series, Unacceptable Truth. If you're a guest today, thanks, Simon. If you're a guest this morning, my name is Ryan. If you're tuning in online, welcome. If maybe this is your first time tuning in or first time being here, my name is Ryan. I'm the lead pastor here at Crossroads. And just great to have you here. I would love to connect with you if you have any questions about our church, questions about myself. I'd love to hear more of your story, help you find your way around as you're kind of thinking about Crossroads as maybe a church for you. Want to welcome everybody as well. So my cell phone number is inside of that program. Just send me a text message. We'll get together for coffee, whiskey, whatever you prefer. Really, whatever you want to pay for, I'm up for it. So whatever when you want to go house shopping together, you want to buy me a house, that's fine. It'd be a weird first date, but that's okay. No problem. We'll figure it out. And it's good to see John Smith, our founding pastor, here today. Thank you for being here, John. I have this imagination in my mind that every time John comes, he just leaves disappointed with he's like, oh my gosh, that Ryan, what were we thinking? No, I love him. He's so wonderful. So make sure you say hi to him and thank him for 22 years of leadership, right? Is it 23, 24, 25, 37, 58 years of leadership, founding such a beautiful community. And this is a special place. The more I get to talk with folks, the more I always realize it's a very special place that has been from its beginning. So we are grateful for you and your leadership, John. Thank you so very much. So we want to talk about spiritual emptiness this week. And if you weren't here for the last couple weeks, we kind of set up what we're doing for the next 5 weeks. And you can listen to that in the app or watch it, whatever you prefer. But what we're going to do is I'm going to kind of do a short introduction, kind of level setting about each of the unacceptable truths that we're trying to tackle as a church. And then we're going to hopefully interview an expert in the field that's really working to rewrite those things. So today we're going to talk about spiritual emptiness, our first unacceptable truth, of which we're working to replace spiritual emptiness with spiritual vitality. Now, one thing to remember is this. We said this in week 1. It's that it's our acceptable behavior that often leads to unacceptable truths, right? So it's the things that we as a culture often are just okay with. We can justify it. We justify it with our politics. We justify it with our economics. We justify it with our religious beliefs. And it's those acceptable behaviors that often lead to an unacceptable truth that is oppressive to some segment in our world, right? And if that's of interest to you, that statement, you can hear more about that where I drone on and on about that point in week 1. But it's important to remember that as we get started, that as we talk about each of these unacceptable truths in our world, we have to really start with what is the behavior that I accept in myself? What's the beliefs that I accept in myself or that I was handed that have actually created, right, the chasm that's created the pain and the suffering, all right? Now, spiritual emptiness, we say around here, is really this lack of confidence in the goodness and the nearness of the divine. There's a philosopher, theologian who I find really fascinating, and he says that we should stop using the word God for at least 100 years. We've gotten it so wrong, right? That we should really, so you'll actually, we actually try to say, okay, how can we be careful? Because when I say the word God, there's all kinds of images and ways of thinking that show up in the room. Like as many people as there are here, when I say the word God, you're going to put an attachment to that word based upon your own experience, which is going to be different than even the people maybe sitting at your own table or sitting next to you or sitting down a few rows, right? But when we talk about it here, we talk about spiritual emptiness as an existence in which we really have no confidence in the goodness and we have no confidence in the nearness of the divine reality, right? And what happens is that lack of confidence really leads to and comes and flows out of a place of fear, right? So spiritual emptiness is really flows out of the fear of that divine reality. So the lack of confidence is oftentimes not neutrality, right? It's really fear, right? So if you imagine like a faucet in our lives, this faucet of fear will fill us up and we become spiritually empty, right? Now I'm not talking about, I know some of you are Bible people in here. And you're like, well, Ryan, it says in the Word of God, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of all wisdom. How many of y'all have ever heard that before? Raise your hand up nice and high, own that one. So first of all, we won't tackle that one today because I don't even know, like you've probably heard it said, well, what that means is respect. Like, I don't know if that's what that means. I don't know if the writer actually thought that, no, you need to be afraid of Hashem Yahweh, which was the Hebrew understanding of the divine. Like, you should be afraid of this God and what this God can do to you, and then you'll act wisely, right? I'm not so sure that that isn't truly what the writer was actually saying. Now, we have the experience of Jesus, right, that can inform that, right? But I'm definitely not talking about a respect for the divine. I am not saying that we shouldn't have a respect for this idea of the wonder and mystery of the divine. I'm actually saying literally fearing God, right? The theistic idea that there's a being out there in the sky somewhere outside of our existence who actually every now and then intervenes when God wants to, when God is so moved to. And sometimes that God will intervene with punishments that are just rewards for our behavior, right? That kind of fear ultimately leads to a place of spiritual emptiness, right? It's a fear of what God will do to me at the end of my life, what God won't do to me at the end, or what God will do to a family member, a person I love, or what God won't do. In my life, a long time ago, I just had to come to this space where I said, I will no longer be afraid of God. And any image that puts me in fear of that God, I will reject, no matter how many Bible verses somebody can give to me. And that changed my whole perception of life and was really the beginning for me of a movement out of spiritual emptiness into spiritual vitality. And I was a pastor at the time. Think about that. Walking around without any lack of confidence, totally empty and devoid. And so there's this reality that like fear sets in for this God, and then what do? Well, we work hard. Anybody ever tried to work hard for God's approval? Raise your hand nice and high. Own that one with me. Come on. And we take like things like spiritual habits and spiritual disciplines and these beautiful things that are meant to encourage us, that are meant to transform us, that we participate in as a way of moving forward with our faith, right? And they can be beautiful things, but they then become very heavy and burdensome. I can remember growing up as a kid in like youth group and like, you need a journal. And I always talk about, I tried to journal. I have like 20 journals all with one page in them. Because I always thought a new journal would be the trick, right? If I just got a new one, then I would be okay, right? A lot of pressure there on a 14-year-old, right? It's like, what were we thinking? But that's the idea. And so these things then become progressive. And then what happens is spiritual emptiness, fear, leads to a like heavy and worn down soul. Like that's all I know how to describe it, is we walk around with a heavy, worn down soul. And here's what's so beautiful. Jesus, in Matthew's story about the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, Matthew tells us that Jesus says this. He says, come to me, all you who are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Now, if that describes your religious reality, like from the time you were a kid, good for you. I really don't like you. And that's the jealousy in me, right? But that's the experience that Jesus wants in the Gospel of Matthew. Like, and Jesus, remember, would say, like, I've come for the lost sheep of Israel. And he would hang out with the people called sinners, right? And those were his folks. And because they existed oftentimes outside of their religious structures and system, because they didn't have the money to go and maintain everything that they had to so that they could be accepted in the temple practices. And so they lived in a space of spiritual emptiness oftentimes, trying to figure out how can I make God happy, or living in fear of their God because they couldn't participate in the system that would say you're okay. And so Jesus says, well, come to me, I'm going to give you rest. He says, but you got to take my yoke upon you. And you've got to learn from me. And then he says, I'm gentle and humble in heart. And I think that's beautiful. And I hold to this as I read all of Scripture, that any image of God that isn't gentle and humble in heart and giving rest is a man-made understanding of God, one that we often do, that all of us are guilty of, right? It says, so come, and then you'll find what? Rest for your souls. Right? We'll lift that burden. He says, because my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Right? It's amazing how the yoke of loving your neighbor, the yoke of including, the yoke of forgiveness, it is a light yoke. Now, it doesn't mean it's not hard at times, but the burden to love everyone is so much lighter than figuring out who am I supposed to love and who am I supposed to judge. This burden to walk through this world as a source of light and love is truly light, right? And so we see in Jesus this come to me, very few spiritual activities that he puts on people, very few religious laws, and none of that. He actually kind of says, hey, listen, like God is as near as this water here in the Jordan River. Let's get baptized, right? There was no temple involved. There was no bring the sacrifice, right? Not that those things were bad in and of themselves. And so what we see, and this is where we oftentimes get confused, spiritual vitality is not spiritual activity. Can I get somebody to say amen to that? Right? We can be so involved with spiritual activities and still be burdened down. When our spiritual activity does not release us from fear, doesn't release us from the idea that God is just waiting for us to mess up. Right? When our spiritual activity doesn't release us into joy, then we're actually moving in the wrong, and we're just activity for the sake of activity. So spiritual vitality, then, we can think of it as having a rest-filled soul. Like a rest-filled soul. And a soul that is confident in the deep, transformative love and grace and goodness and power of the divine in which we live and move and have our being. I got that tattooed right here, that whole sentence. I got it tattooed right here. That's what I want in my heart, right? That's what I want to be. I want to be a person who has a soul that is rest-filled, even if I'm busy, because I believe in the work, right? Even if I'm busy, even if I'm trying to think through, like, how can I contribute? How can I rewrite the unacceptables? Even as I'm participating in spiritual activities, I want to have a rest-filled soul that isn't all stressed out. Everything doesn't have to be perfect. I don't have to get all angry and upset, right? When there's a balloon that's not flying as high as it should on Grads and Dads days. Right? Would have been me 10, 15 years ago. Somebody's head's going to roll. These balloons don't have enough helium. It's foolishness, right? But that's what I want. I want to have a rest-filled soul because I think a rest-filled soul is a non-anxious presence in this world. And people want to be around that. And people find rest in that presence. And I want to be confident that love is transformative, that love is powerful, that love is full of grace, that love is what holds my tomorrow. Right, I love that song that we sang at the opening that says, I know who holds my future, or I know who holds the future. For me, when I sing that song, it's really not a who, right? Because I don't think of God as a who, although I think God is personal. But I know that love holds my future because that's what I'm living in. And I can have a confidence in that no matter what happens, if my life is lived towards love, loving my enemy, loving my neighbor, loving my friends, then there's a lightness to that. Okay, so now we want to have a conversation. So the idea is, I'm going to give you a little setup, and then we're going to have a conversation with an expert each week. So let's have a little conversation with spiritual vitality expert, Reverend Aaron Gilmore. Do me a favor, welcome Aaron out. Aaron, come on out and join us. You may recognize Aaron, who spoke maybe, 2 months ago, maybe March, something like that. Aaron, you are the conference minister for the Rocky Mountain Conference of the United Church of Christ.
Correct.
Did I get that right?
Oh, the whole thing.
I love it. Thank you very much. Which just means Aaron really works deeply supporting churches within the United Church of Christ throughout, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, those 3 states. That's a big chunk of geography, right? And really helping communities be spiritually vital, helping leaders be spiritually vital, all that good work. And this is kind of you've been doing work in that for a very long time, but as of last week, this is kind of a new.
Yeah, newly conference minister.
I love it.
Yep.
So we're like the first place for you to come.
I am the first church I've been in with that new title.
I love it. So Aaron, I love it when we get to have conversations. You're so wise, insightful. You are a non-anxious presence. You provide an energy where people can just be themselves and wrestle and question. And I've appreciated that personally. So thank you. And thank you for bringing that into our space. So let me ask this question. Let's talk about those acceptable behaviors, right? So we said that in this idea of unacceptable truths, there are always acceptable behaviors. What do you think are some of the acceptable behaviors in our world, in our religious systems that contribute to spiritual emptiness?
Yeah, I appreciate it. Well, first, I just want to qualify, spiritual expert spiritual vitality expert
Absolutely.
Feels a little like I'm a person here who can see experts and help us point to those, the wisdom. But Yeah, when I think about those acceptable behaviors, it's like I like that you asked about behaviors and not just beliefs. I think what's acceptable in a lot of religious systems that there is a right path or a right practice, or that there are those who are upstanding. They do the right things. They practice the right prayers. They do the right practices, and they are included. And then there are those who are excluded. And I think depending on what side of that you're on, like there's an acceptable behavior that's just how we are in religious systems. But then also for those who are on the outside of that, who maybe haven't grown up in that, like, oh, I have the right way or I have the right path. There's like, that's not for me, right? That's sort of accepted. When I was a pastor in Salt Lake City, the number of people I would talk to that would just tell me, oh, I walked right by the church because I know that's not for me. Like it was not for me.
Yeah.
I think the other acceptable thing in society too is just that busyness you were talking about, right? Like we just fill our lives with so much busyness, and I think that's in this thinking that we have to perform, we have to earn it, we have to work for it, we have to prove something.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like, we accept that in our society.
Yeah, we were having a conversation last week kind of about this, and we were talking about like what are some of the theologies that just segments of our tradition accept as, well, this is the only way to think about this, or this is the only way it's ever been thought of. And one thing we talked about was this really fancy language of penal substitutionary atonement, but this way of seeing beauty in the cross that depicts God as a being that you can't get to because you're so terrible.
Depraved.
And the only way you can get to this God would be through the really archaic, practices of animal sacrifice, and we need to end that. So then Jesus has to die because we're so bad. And we say that's the only way. How do you think that theology, which is one of many theologies of the cross, right? But many of us grow up with that's the only one that's true. And like what you said, like there's only one right way, right? Mm-hmm. How does that theology in particular, do you think, contribute to spiritual emptiness?
Gosh, it just like for me, and I know we all have different beliefs, right? But like the way my spiritual vitality really started taking root was believing that there was a piece of God in me, that or that divine, right? That there's this imprint or there's this spark, and so if there's no way to get to that, like there's just this, there's no hope. Is where it just leads to this sense of like. Worthlessness, the spiritual emptiness of like so much fear that there's like that God had to do that for me. That leads to a pretty, I think, lonely place.
Yeah, and even like lonely, like I also sometimes think of the word transactional.
Yeah.
Right, like I was steeped, and there's some beautiful things about my spiritual heritage, but like when you're steeped in that, like your relationship with the divine, your interaction with the divine feels very transactional, right? Very transactional. So where does that all lead, right? If we just stay in a space of spiritual emptiness as a person, as an individual, in a space of fear or in a space of busyness that flows out of like fear of this is it, like when life ends, so I need to make the most of it. So now I'm going after all the success or whatever. Like, where does that lead to a person? Like, what's the end result, do you think?
Well, I mean, the song shared, I think that's loneliness. I think there's a sense of hopelessness. I think it can lead to, like, there's just no way, like, how do I get out of this? It's just more and more that heaviness, that burden that Jesus talks about in Matthew. And disconnected, right? Like, and how do I find my way out of that?
Yeah. When you said, like, just the burden, I had this, like, image of a backpack that, like, every experience in life that is heavy, that produces fear, it's like another weight just goes in the backpack, and it just always adds up and adds up and adds up, and then it's on us to just, well, I'm just supposed to be stronger to carry all of
Yeah,
this
better
weight.
just do more weightlifting. Carry
Exactly.
heavier
I gotta
backpack.
do all that weightlifting.
I think about too that like it's a backpack of perfection. Like I have to show up right. Like there's just for me that backpack just like that fear of seeing. I have to also be like I don't want to let what's in there out, like whatever the fear or the perfection.
Yeah, so I end up presenting who I'm not.
Yes.
Because who I am would not be good enough
right.
for the performance.
So I can only
factor.
show part of me. I can only show up but I'm carrying this really heavy thing that's like where all the real stuff is, but I can't show it.
Yeah, which is exhausting, like living split-souled.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Always having to kind of navigate that, yeah. So if that's what spiritual emptiness leads to and kind of looks like, we'll get to like some ways in which we can move there, but what do you think spiritual vitality looks like? What does it look like on the outside? Like if I'm encountering a person, or even what does it feel like on the inside?
Yeah. Yeah, this question just made me think like, oh, who do I think is spiritually vital, and what do they, what do I notice? There is I don't know if that's the word humility, but there's two sides of it, right? Humility is not thinking too highly of ourselves or thinking we have all the answers, but humility is also not thinking too less of ourselves. So like there's people who I meet who there is just that confidence. Like I don't think too little of myself. Like and I there is a confidence in that it's not up to me. That there is something I can have confidence, something bigger than me that I'm connected to, that is moving in my life, that is helping me expand love's presence in the world, right? I see that in people. But there's also not and there's an openness to still knowing, and this is where I am now. Like there's an openness to others. There's openness to people's stories and how God might show up in that person. So it looks, not the opposite of frantic, I guess, right? Like there is ease. There is, so there's an ease, but there's also an and I get to participate in this thing, this movement of love. I have a piece of it. I have a part of it. I have worth in this kingdom that we're trying to build, right? I have a place in that space.
Yeah, as you were saying that, I think like the word that comes to mind is like I can be present. Like I can be in the moment knowing that something's going to unfold here, and I don't have this anxiety about it. I don't, but to be in that space, fully present to right now.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Kind of experience. What do you do a lot of work with congregations, communities of faith. What would you say are some of the marks? And I know it's a hot word, and I'm not referring to that. Yeah. I have like flashbacks of my own trauma with it, filling that out. But like, what would you say, like, this is the fruit, like, when I go into communities of faith, like, here's how I can know, like, there's a spiritual vitality here.
Yeah.
Or, boy, there's a spiritual emptiness here. Like, what do you think are some of those fruits, those signs that say, well, as a community?
Yeah. No, I love that question. I'm thinking about one church recently visited not too long ago, and I'm the moderator of our conference is the pastor there, so I'm talking about this church a lot. But out in Creed, there is a sense of we're here to love, and we're not here to grow the church per se. Like this is what things Sarah says all the time. We're not here to grow the church. We're here to be the church. And what does that look like? So. They are looking out and saying, okay, where is there a need in the community? Where is there pain in the community? How do we show up with that? And how do we be with them? I think of, there's an ease in the Sunday morning. I feel it here too, actually. Like there's just this ease. There's there's a flow. You're participating in something bigger, right? You're not creating it, but you're participating in it.
Yeah. So then, like maybe the opposite would be true. A spiritual emptiness, could be small, could be big, but it's inward. It's not participation in something bigger.
It's almost like
per se.
there's it for me. It feels like we're going through motions, but we're not actually present. Back to that word. There's not a presence. There's not a. We're talking about God, but we're not experiencing God. We're
That's good.
teaching about God, but we're not embracing the love. Like we're not embracing the world. We're just talking about the world. Or
Yeah.
does that make
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Somebody should tweet that. We're talking about God but not experiencing God. Yeah, that makes sense. So, okay, so what are some practices, struggles, decisions, things that we can do as individuals to promote spiritual vitality in our lives? And then what are some things that we could do as a community to promote it at the community level?
Yeah. It may seem simple, but one of the practices and strategies for me is, throughout Scripture, there is so much pointing us towards the natural world of where there is a flow, right? There is ease, and so whether it's just my backyard and going into my garden or up to the mountains, we have an incredible resource here. Going out on the lake, whatever it is, there is it's helpful for me to go to those places where the river is being the river and the tree is being the tree, and the tree, and maybe I'm doing some personification here, but the aspen leaves clap, and so there's something in being in the natural world and being in this where, Master Eckhart says, so full of God is every creature that I would never have to preach a sermon, something like that. If I just gaze upon God's creation, if I just gaze upon the natural world, there is a reminder that I am part of that. It's an easy way in for me to sometimes connect to that divine in a beautiful way and countering that fear, right? Like it just is. There's an isness.
What a great picture. I was just thinking as you're saying, it's like, I don't have to work for the river to exist.
It exists.
It exists. I don't have to work for the tree to be beautiful or for the fall to come. These things happen. But on the other side of it, I have to actually get my butt up and go out there.
Yeah.
Right? Like I could look at a picture.
Yeah, not quite the same.
Which is interesting because there's a difference between effort and work. Right? Like there's some amazing hikes in northern Colorado and in the Rocky Mountains that get you to amazing views and vistas and things. There's effort involved in the participation, but in the participation is existence, right? And there's so much that flows and energizes.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, and the other, I think the practice, two things on a communal level. I think how do we create spaces of belonging, right? Spaces that really honor. We don't have to put all that stuff in our backpack. We can lay that burden down. I think it is about how do we be more human together, more authentically human, more real. How do we create spaces of belonging that allow us to bring the whole of who we are, imperfect, cracked, beautiful, create spaces where we get to be the whole of ourselves, and that in fact it is in that space where we tell our true stories, our real stories, and listen to one another. I think the divine is present in those spaces. And so like as a church community, I think about what's one of the things we work on or think about in our faith communities is how do we create spaces of belonging, and not necessarily safe space, but brave space.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's not going to be safe to be necessarily honest, but it's brave. We can hold one another. God holds us in this. So creating spaces of belonging and truly seeing one another and being seen, right, as beloved. And then the other piece, I think, as communities, and this, I think there's something that invites us out into, again, where is their pain? Where is, proximity to pain? It's kind of paradoxical, but when we can touch on others' pain or our own, that is also where there is life. Like they're just connected. That's where I feel that, I don't know if now I'm taking another mystic, Hildegard of Bingen, but she talks about the greening of God, or the viriditas, versus the ariditas is spiritual emptiness, viriditas is spiritual life. And it's in that proximity to where there is pain, where there is suffering, that life shows up.
Yeah, making space for the brokenness and being close to it and not trying to fix it,
Not
but
trying
just
to
letting
fix
it
it,
fix
just
you.
be.
It reminds me of, there's a band that Wendy and I really like called Judah and the Lion, and they have this song that just came out on their album, and it says, 6 feet deep is where you have to go to find the beauty of this life. That like there's something about, no matter what space is, and I think that the imagery of a grave that's dug 6 feet deep, right? Like there is pain, there is hurt that you have to go to, that you have to be at. And the song's called Dark Night of the Soul, interestingly enough. But, and it's like, you cannot, unless you get proximate to that in your life, in the life of others, you really can't come out. Let me ask this question. As a person, right, and I'm encountering and I'm in relationship with other people, like what can I do at a personal level when I'm with someone and you get this sense that there's a spiritual emptiness there, that there's a pain, maybe they've opened up and shared with you, like what are things that we can do in that moment to be a source of spiritual vitality? I mean, is that the moment where we say, hey, the problem is you haven't invited Jesus into your heart. Let's just kneel down right here in the cafeteria and take care of business and everything will be fine? Or is that the moment where you're like, well, you got to come to my church because my church is way better than your church? And like, what are we, like everybody who goes to this church is laughing because they know that's not true. They're like, well, that's not true. But like, what are some things that we can do in that moment of people who maybe do have a measure of spiritual vitality?
Such a great question. I mean, it comes back to the word of being present. I just be with the pain. Don't try to don't fix, don't change, be present. Like allow that. Like if you have to go 6 feet, let them go maybe down to the 3rd foot, right? Like be present with it and be someone who is okay with someone sharing your pain, their pain with you. Yeah. And I think one of my wise mentors talks about we can grieve partway by ourselves, but it's when we grieve in community, when someone else sees our grief, that we actually can move through it. And so I think not trying to fix, not trying to make it all better, but being with and saying, thank you for sharing that story with me. Thank you for sharing where you really are.
That's good. Peter Rollins, one of just my favorite philosophers, he does this thing called transformative art, where he creates spaces that really allow you to kind of go into really fairly dark spaces of theology and let things go. And one of the things that Peter Rollins will talk about is he'll create this space where you can do the opposite of what you're supposed to do. So like I grew up in an environment where the only stories you ever heard on the stage were the stories of victory and here's how I overcame this and here's all the, right? But what we need to have is the opposite. Like we need to have the stories of pain, that this is where I am and I don't know that there is a God that's going to do what I want, right? That there's some, as I hear you talk, like I hear there's some for transformation, there's some necessary space for that transformative testimony. Here's how God disappointed me and continues to disappoint me, right? And if we make space for that, we can actually learn to let go of that idea.
And let something new in, right?
But that's scary, like
so
you said.
Scary.
That's really scary to create space for those things. So let's finish with this question.
Okay.
We finish every message with this question because one of the things about our church is that we just want to be a gathering of people who want to become better humans, and we want to make the world a better place, which I think the theological word for that is the glory of God, right?
Yeah.
So to give glory to God, I don't know what that means. But in real world language, it's like, oh, well, if I can be a better version of myself, then I'm living into the divine image and a better world for everyone. So how does spiritual vitality do that? If everybody in here could come to a space of spiritual vitality, how does that affect our job, workplaces, our homes, our own lives? What do you think?
I think about the statistic of 40% of the adults are lonely. And I don't know, there's something like when you said a better version of ourselves, we're going to show up to our workplaces differently. We're going to show up in our neighborhoods, that ease, that presence, that's one way. In daily life, like if there's an energy in us, there's a peace in us, there's a ease in us. that maybe we can become a little bit of hope in the world, that there is another way. Wait a minute, there's something going on in that person. What's that? I want to know what that is. So by our presence, by our peacefulness, that inner peace, like what shows up on the inside comes on the outside. I believe that mirrors what we happens on the inside. How do we mirror that on the outside? I think there's every daily interaction there could be a moment. So yes, there's big lofty goals of how that might change, but I think it's in the day-to-day interactions, how we show up in the moments of stress and anxiety and fighting, and we're still going to do that. We're still going to be anxious, but there is I love the word confidence, right? There is that's not all there is. That there's a way within which, even as we are struggling here, if I'm showing up with that peace of Christ, that ease of Christ, we move through it. There's just there's more connection in the world.
Yeah. Three things as you were talking that struck me. This spiritual vitality creates compassionate, connected, and confident people. Right? And that's what we need. Without those three things, we can be, I know a lot of very confident people in forms of religion that produce a lot of death and violence and hatred and pain and suffering in our own tradition and in other traditions. But when you combine that to understanding my connectedness, right? And then that confidence to just, this person at work doesn't like me. And that's okay. They've got whatever going on in their world, and I can still love them. And all of that combined together.
Yeah, I ask myself a question. This is my practice every day, is no matter what is happening, how can I show up with insight and compassion?
I love it. I love it. I have failed at that miserably.
I do too, every day. But it's I seek.
I'm not asking that question every day. Are you kidding me? My self-esteem will be worse than what it already is, Aaron. No, that's great. I love it. Hey, can we thank Aaron for being here with us today?
Thank you for having me.
So we're gonna share in communion together here in just a moment. We're gonna do it a little differently today, in that we'd love for everyone to hold the elements. So as you get the bread and the juice from either your table or one of the tables in the back, we want you to just hold it and listen to this song that's getting ready to be played and that Kia's going to sing for us. You'll recognize the tune. It's an old hymn tune, but it has been reimagined through the eyes of a person who is striving for spiritual vitality, leaving a place of spiritual emptiness that flowed out of a religious experience that was harmful. I think it's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful song that brought me to tears the first time I heard it. And so we want this song to be a gift for our gathering today, where we can not just talk about God, but we can experience God together. So Kia will play a little bit and give those of you that are in the back and on the sides in rows a chance to get your communion and have a seat. If you're a guest today, communion is for everyone. It's a symbol that the table is set for divine love, for forgiveness, for grace, for all humanity. And so you're welcome to participate. There's no class to take, no document to sign, no money to give, none of those things. This is what I believe is the cornerstone of our faith in its most beautiful expression. A table that's set, a banquet that's prepared for everyone. So go out to the highways and the byways and compel them to come in, because there's beauty in that space. And so that's what this moment is about. And as we're doing this, I want to invite you to ask yourself this question at a meditative moment in a contemplative space of, what is it that God's inviting me into today? Right? We ask this question every day every week because we don't want to just come and talk about God. We want to experience the divine, and we want to come and trust that the divine is offering me an invitation. Not inviting me into more work, but maybe inviting me into some effort, maybe inviting me into an experience, maybe inviting me into stillness, whatever it might be. But some things you might think about is this week, as we talk about spiritual vitality, is take a 2-hour retreat. Not a 2-day, not 1 day, let's not go crazy, 2 hours. Take a 2-hour retreat, kind of get everything away, and just sit and contemplate and think about, maybe ask yourself some questions about each of these, but think about the fruits of the Spirit. love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, long-suffering, all these things. If you're not sure what that means and you want to give it a try, or you're not where it's found, it's one of the safer things you can Google. Just Google fruits of the Spirit, and you'll get a list right there, or ask ChatGPT, and ChatGPT will tell you very accurately what the fruits of the Spirit are. You can even ask ChatGPT, what should I do to exhibit these in my life? And ChatGPT will tell you, like, we have created God. I'm just telling you. Maybe just take 2 hours. And I say 2 hours because it's going to take you about an hour and 45 minutes to just quiet yourself. So it's really a 15-minute retreat. And let thoughts pass as clouds. Don't worry about, oh, I'm so distracted. Just, maybe spend 2 hours and ask yourself, which of these fruits of the Spirit comes naturally to me and which comes unnaturally to me? Because I think the fruits of the Spirit are a great exhibition of spiritual vitality in our lives. That where patience is difficult, it flows. I can flow in patience. I can live in patience when it's difficult, when my 3-year-old is exhausting it, right? Those are the moments. I want to encourage you to jump into the summer growth journey. We have some daily readings, 3 of them a week, a question to consider, ponder for this series. So we'll have 3 that come out this week. If you haven't signed up for that yet, I would encourage you to sign up for it. And then we have a thing called the Way of Peace, which is kind of Peacemaking 201. And it's an opportunity to look at what are some of those rules of life that we can apply to live as a peacemaker. And it's the effort, right? It's the things that we can commit to that are like walking out to the beautiful view of the river, right? To live at that space. And so I think it's a way of redeeming maybe some things that we've talked about as spiritual habits or spiritual activities that become work, but to recognize them as a way of peace. Like, this is a way of promoting. And so we have that material in the app, but we'll have a conversation group for that in the fall. And if you haven't yet gone through that, I would encourage you to just get on the list to know when the next one's coming. And that could be a great next step in your own spiritual vitality, all right? So if you're in the back or on the sides, I want to invite you to grab your communion elements. If you're at your tables, they're all there. And then Kia's going to really sing this song over you. And pay attention to the lyrics. They're very, very powerful and transformative.